Welcome to Tailwinds, the podcast for Air and Space Operations Review. I'm Dr. Laura Thurston-Goodrow, and today we are visiting with Anessa Kimball, the author of Canada's Open Door on 9/11, Adapting NORAD, in our winter 2022 issue. Dr. Kimball is a professor of political science and director of the Center for International Security at the School of Advanced International Studies at Laval University in Quebec City. Professor Kimball uses quantitative methods and rational institutionalist approaches to examine the institutional design of defense and security cooperation arrangements and defense burden sharing. They are the author of Beyond 2%, NATO Partners, Institutions, and Burden Management, Concepts, Risks, and Models, released in print in January. Anessa, welcome to Tailwinds.
Thank you. Good morning.
So first of all, please tell us a little bit about your interest in the subject of North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, as most of us know it.
Yes, I came to studying NORAD a little bit, I would say, backwards, one might say. My initial interest was actually in formal security and defense agreements, such as NATO and formal alliances. And when I moved to Canada, one of the things that I became interested in more and more is the fact that a lot of the Canadian discourse about military pretty much invokes either NATO or NORAD. And so as I started looking at NORAD and learning more about it, it became quite interesting because it's an agreement that started out quite informally, and we see now what it is in its actual operational structure, and we've obviously recently seen what it does. And so to me, this was interesting from an institutional perspective, trying to learn how informal institutions can become more formalized over time and take on what would be, as most people think of it, as actually a treaty. And so that's how I came to study NORAD. And then the interest in 9/11 kind of followed on as in a project I was working on that was actually on NORAD institutional adaptation.
Very interesting. So to 9/11, since that's what you kind of use as a framework, I remember it distinctly. I am that old. But a lot of us, including me, are not aware of the impact it had on Canada. And the many ways Canadians actually helped avert what could have been a global commercial air disaster when the U.S. abruptly closed its airspace that morning. I found it really interesting. And so I'd like you to tell us some more about that.
Mm-hmm. And so as I was doing research on NORAD renewals, there were renewals in 1996, in 2000, and in 2006. And obviously, during that period, we saw some quite large changes to the international system. And so just that as a context to understanding how the agreement changed was quite interesting. And as I got into doing the field research, of course, one of the things you would ask about during that period in retrospect when I was doing this field work in 2013 is of 9/11. And as the story started to unfold, I realized that there really was this side story that happened that Americans really were not tuned into. And of course, I'm an American. I was doing my doctoral studies. I was in the middle of New York State at SUNY Binghamton. And so to me, this had passed pretty much as a story within a story that we didn't really appreciate. And as I saw kind of doing the field research, this story actually, as this unfolded, a couple mechanisms happened afterwards, as we know. And Canada was able to use the goodwill that it had kind of created in managing this mini mobility crisis to modify the agreement. And so, of course, I found the story quite captivating, and I had the opportunity to interview, the people that were making the decisions, like David Cullinett, like Rick Finley, who would have been, literally right there having the communications in the moment. And so kind of piecing together this timeline and really telling the narrative while also unfolding how it was possible because of the institutional differences between how the US and how Canada manages their airspace. And so to me, that was really part of trying to pull this apart in some senses, but also make it accessible to readers, and especially, those of us like you said, who kind of we lived through 9/11, and I think for a lot of us, particularly that work in international security and defense, it was something like the end of the Cold War that really, was a shock to how we think about a lot of things, including North Atlantic and North American defense.
Yes, it really was. It was the most profound thing that's happened in my lifetime. I know that. So again, I was really interested in I encourage readers when they go back to read through your article to kind of get some of that, on the ground history, the redirecting flights and flights landing in
Yes.
Newfoundland. Was it Newfoundland? Or
yes. And so as it happened, basically, as we know, in the US, we were watching kind of everything unfold on television. And when the United States closed its airspace, it did this obviously because there was a national security threat. These planes, as I explain in the text, these planes had come from a civilian air source, which was not something that the military had normally practiced. This was something that was really out of the box for thinking about what might be used as a weapon, even though we would learn later that some of these threads of what might happen was going on. I think what's really clear in the narrative and the reflection of the narrative by the stakeholders at the moment is essentially that, there was a terrorist threat, but how it would manifest itself was really unclear. And so in that moment on the day in the morning when the U.S. closed its airspace, this was, a decision that was extremely important, obviously, as there was a crisis going on and we were watching, literally in, a day which was very tragic where thousands of Americans and thousands of international citizens lost their lives. There was this other crisis that happened when the airspace closed because all of these flights that were over the Atlantic and mostly over the Atlantic, somewhat over the Pacific, but over the Atlantic because it was AM on the East Coast, all of these flights were stuck in the air. The U.S. basically said, you're not welcome. We're closing our airspace. And, you can imagine that all of a sudden the Brits and the Canadians, were looking at the North Atlantic saying, okay, now we have a job to do. And so in the end, as Colleen explains, NAV Canada with the Brits took those 239 flights. They analyzed every single flight individually, determined, actually, there were more than 600 flights at the time that were in the air. They were able to return more than half of the flight. That was one thing that we were extremely grateful for that. And, literally, there was no other loss of life in civilian aviation that day because those people, managed that so expertly and so, so quickly. It was seamless. I mean, obviously for travelers on that day, it was a shock. Landing in Canada, I'm sure must have been quite a shock. And what happened as they analyzed these flights, obviously there were some that they had been held in the air for a while. So some were becoming extremely close to being in danger, which is how Goose Bay and Gander, Newfoundland became, Goose Bay is an Air Force's base that had these long runways from World War II that had been maintained. And so these planes could land there, which is kind of shocking if you think about it, bringing in these large modern airliners into a very small, it's arguably a secondary, even tertiary military. And then, simply the massive job, as we know now, of what would have been screening and hosting and, reconnecting all of these people onto their various destinations after they came to Canada. And it was done in a matter of 3 to 5 days, more or less, which is also amazing. And, this really happened because of the institutional structures and because that trust really existed already. And so when the U.S. made that decision, Canada and the Brits stepped in, they landed the flight, things were managed. And of course, there were some things that didn't actually make it into the text, which I found, there's a little bit of a story about a Korean Airlines flight that actually had to be escorted by NORAD fighters that morning because, in fact, the pilot and co-pilot did not speak enough English. And so they didn't understand when they were told they could no longer go to Seattle.
Wow.
And so this is a whole side story that, which is fascinating. And so literally what happened is you can imagine, they're calling this flight and they're saying you can no longer, obviously they know that they can no longer land. And then they're trying to contact the flight. And at the time, of course, another side story is that this communication was also happening through more secrets. It was actually going through Morse code at the moment because, they had hijacked planes. At those moments, we didn't actually know if they were into the aviation communication systems internationally. And so, you can imagine how this is going. And there was a very tense moment because it was actually supposed to go to Vancouver. And once they started having the communication issues, they redirected it to Yellowknife. And so
really?
It landed.
Oh my gosh.
Because, of course, they had no idea what was going on, right? It was difficult to communicate with the pilots.
That's a long ways from nowhere.
Exactly, right? And so you can imagine how, the decision was literally immediately made like, okay, we don't know if this is part of what's going on. The information environment was so sparse at the time. It was in, let's take as few risks as possible. And so land this flight in Yellowknife, it was met, on the runway, police, all emergency, and these poor passengers and pilots coming off, and they're just a bit confused. They're expecting to be in Seattle. They're in northern Canada. And so, these are some of the side stories that were extremely rich that you can't put in those things. But to me, this is one of the reasons why I found that this was it was a story that was not told on 9/11, very much to our American colleagues. And in the aftermath, there were a couple things that happened which were extremely important. Of course, the binational planning cell emerged. It became a binational planning group. And because you may also recall, this is also not in the text, but at the time, there was also a rumor right after 9/11 that some of these terrorists had passed through Canada into
the
United States,
yeah,
right? It ended up being completely false, right? It was an extremely large piece of disinformation. And so as I was doing the interviews, this was like pretty much spontaneously brought up by many of the interviewees, even though I never brought it up as an interviewer. And so again, that piece really changed the willingness in Ottawa because they understood all of a sudden that this relationship that they had been fostering and taking care of since the 1930s, 1938 with Ogdensburg, all of a sudden there was a little bit of risk at it. And not only that, but like NORAD was at risk, which to the Canadians is extremely important in terms of understanding the United States, communicating with the United States, being there to get that information. As we know, some of the tasks that NORAD does for the Canadians, it's a link that's kind of essential for their national security and for their defense. But on the other hand, in the United States, I think it's often something that, of course, very punny here, goes under the radar. We don't talk about it very much. And again, that was one of the things that was interesting in the fact that through the renewals, because it was so important and became very foundational to both countries in these reflections after 9/11, NORAD was able to kind of save itself in some senses from being placed on the wayside, which could have been very much happened in that period with George Bush, who is extremely, you're with us or you're against us. Those types of discourses were very frightening up here in Canada. There was a lot of, we need to make sure that there is a solid place for this institution in North American defense and in North American security. And so one of the ways it did that through recommendation by the BPG was that NORAD enlarged its mandate to include maritime situational warning and awareness. And so we didn't change the name, but we went to an entirely new domain, which was extremely interesting. And one of the things I explored in the interviews was the fact that it was limited to warning and awareness, particularly because of the stakeholder issue, that they felt that going beyond into command and control brought in Coast Guards, brought in navies, which complicated the NORAD concept, which was always a concept of putting in the key stakeholders, kind of trying to depoliticize it. And so to me, I thought that this mentality of thinking was extremely consistent with then later when NORAD became an agreement in perpetuity, that it is no longer renewed. It goes through a review every 4 years or by request, but it's no longer renewed. And it literally removes it from a lot of political angst, mostly in Ottawa, but it also, one might say kind of saves it a little bit from becoming a weapon, one might say, in DC. And so it exists. It has a place. It has a role that's very clear. And I think what we saw just last week was how adaptable and dynamic that role is when it comes to this cross section of what NORAD does, which includes what we saw, this monitoring of the air balloon, because NOAA literally also has a seat at the headquarters there in Cheyenne. And so you have the National Oceans and Atmosphere Agency right there, because one of NORAD's mandates is also essentially involve monitoring the weather and crises that can occur because of the weather and what that means and military implications. And so I think that one thing, what we saw last week with the spy balloon was very interesting because it brings all of this together in a way that I think we don't normally think about in defense and security. And I think this also highlights something else that is emerging in terms of our reflections, is the fact that the climate change, defense, North American, all of that aspect kind of comes together right there underneath NORAD, right? And so like this was a weather balloon, but was also clearly a surveillance balloon, right? Its path was tracked and, modeled and predicted. You can look at all of the various visuals that are available. What was interesting, a couple of things I found quite interesting, is that the media coverage didn't actually become nationalized or international until it got to Montana, which means that it went all the way across Canada first.
Yes. I was curious about that, when I was thinking about this and last week, and your article came to mind immediately. And I was like, I wonder about that. And I wonder about, we lived in Colorado Springs, so I'm familiar with Cheyenne Mountain and NORAD. And I was thinking there's lots of activity happening there. There's been lots of activity, but you're right. Media is one thing. What we knew is obviously something different, but interesting. I'm sort of interested about conversations, that happen preceding what came out in the media. So, there's all this coordination going on at NORAD that we're just really unaware of, that I think is binational, as you point out, which is, again, from a lay perspective, I think a lot of people just take that for granted. And I just thought it was very interesting.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things is, this really touches on the fact that, NORAD is really monitoring a lot of things at the same time when you're there. If one ever has the opportunity to go there into the headquarters, you see, not only how impressive it is, but you see that literally this communication is quite seamless, between the Canadians and the Americans. And there really is this kind of shared view at what the objective is. And the text, of course, one of the things I think most people don't know is that on 9/11, actually, the Canadian was running NORAD at NORAD in the day, because the American was actually in Washington. So functionally, on the day of NORAD, actually, the commander of NORAD was a Canadian, which is another thing that I think does not get much media attention, but deserves a little bit of credit, minimally.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think that demonstrates that. I mean, almost the fact that nobody knows it demonstrates the fact of how seamless it is, and how this cooperation really occurs, minute to minute. And so what we saw was this air balloon, which NORAD had been tracking it, and since it was released and started going over Russia, it traveled through Alaska. And so, of course, it was in America when it was in Alaska, but again, we did not get that information until it was over Billings, Montana. Why did we learn when it was over Montana? I have an idea why. It's because that is where some of our ballistic missile defenses are in that area. Yes. I also have an idea why they were interested in its path, which could have taken it near such places as Norfolk, which would also be extremely interesting for the Chinese and possibly the Russians. So, I think that as somebody who, can kind of line up some of these things, there are good reasons for why probably that information, they waited until it was kind of spotted more in public and it became more in the public eye before they kind of acknowledged it existed and then tracked it. And
well, you have to, in truth,
exactly.
You've got to give it some time to information gathering.
Well, I mean, there were good. Obviously, there were there's good reasons also to not, because there was no idea. We didn't really know what was in it, what was on it. So there was good reasons to not try to shoot it down over any sort of territory. Right. Which was why it was eventually downed in the waters, but it was basically on the continental shelf, quite easy for everything to be recuperated. So I think it was very strategic when they chose to down it, where they chose to shoot it down. You can also see, essentially it was tracked from. The flight paths are available from the jets that were literally live tracking it when it was coming over. So you can see that it was very clear, we had our eye on it as it was watching, looking below, and I think that this is part of what securing this the North American airspace is about, is that there is this, this seamless defense that happens, the knowledge that passes. And so, some people, I had some media interest saying, to what extent is it like a national security risk? This is not the first balloon. There were actually over at least 3 balloons last year. Right. There's another balloon current that was in Latin America. So, this is not like something new from the Chinese, right? In some senses. And so I think what is interesting to me, at least, is that it brought NORAD kind of onto the back into the political interest. What is NORAD? What does it do? And I think what is interesting is that as somebody that studies burden sharing, for NORAD, what it does and what it provides relative to security organizations like NATO, I think it is a very good bargain for what it's doing and how it operates. And I think that that's also something that's a little bit the untold story or the undersold story of NORAD. Is that we have this institution that's extremely important. And so in the next 6 months to a year, NORAD is facing modernization demands. It must modernize some of its assets. There's going to be a lot of kind of bargaining and talking about, one thing that is that is important in this modernization is the fact that the initial design for NORAD was, looking towards what was then the Soviet Union, right? So we had a posture that was very different than the posture NORAD needs today, which frankly needs to focus a lot more in the Pacific. And so I would, equally in the Pacific, I would say. And so when you look at NORAD, you do see that there is this, and, it's because of historical relations with Europe. It's because in the 1950s, this was where the threat was coming from. And so some of this reflection about NORAD modernization will have to include this Western portion. The challenge for Canada is that is also the area of the country where there's going to be the most challenges if they're wanted to put in assets in Canada, where there's going to be the most challenges to place them politically. And so how will this work out? Will Canada and the United States decide to do NORAD modernization through fixed things? Is there going to be a mix of fixed and mobile? And then we also have this piece coming in that's extremely important and very strong with the Finns and Swedes now coming much closer to Canada and the US by joining NATO.
Right.
And so, in some ways, this completes that arc, over the North that is extremely important.
Right.
So, in the next 6 to 12 months, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how we kind of adapt and how we integrate more fully the Finns and the Swedes, into NATO. It's going to happen. It's a matter of time, very much. And what that's going to look like, on kind of the Arctic and the North American end. And so I think it's an exciting time if you're somebody who's interested in NATO, somebody who's interested in NORAD. There's always something. I like teaching about it. We didn't even talk at all about the strategic defense aspect and all of the challenges through strategic defense. The story today was really just about that slice about 9/11 and how NORAD became a more permanent institution and how NORAD kind of anchored itself in North America in a way that, frankly, no other institution has, which I think also, speaks to, as, William says, you're being connected at the hip in the North America.
Well, it's interesting, too, because I think, when we in defense circles, we tend to think externally, rather than internally. And we there's some level of thought that people don't think about Canada. Canada's kind of like always there. They're just kind of one part of us, which I know drives Canadians crazy. But, we don't think about U.S. Northcom, for example, in the same nearly as often as we might think about EUCOM or AFRICOM or INDOPACOM.
Exactly.
And it's just not even among, unless you're at Northcom, there tends to be more of that external focus, which, that's a different job unless, there's mobilized troops in the United States. Obviously, defense is external, right? Internal is police. But I think Canada, again, gets kind of sucked into that internal policing, mindset that it's internal.
Well, it's because also, frankly, Canadian armed forces have mandates that they have to do that. They have to do disaster relief. And so, this is literally in their forces mandate. So again, I'm an American. And so when I came to Canada, I got up here and it's a very different relationship with your armed forces because frankly, in the United States and in a lot of, Latin American countries, if you see your military in the streets, there's maybe a revolution or a coup d'etat going on, right? And in Canada, if you see soldiers, it's because there's a flood somewhere or there's a blizzard, a pandemic, And so I think that's one thing that's very different about these two military kind of the mandates of the two actors. But one thing that we are seeing, and of course we saw this in the pandemic as well, is that line is becoming increasingly, minimalized. And in countries like Canada, in a lot of our NATO partners, it is by necessity because they don't have those large militaries. They have to kind of multiple task these people because, I mean, frankly, they're very highly trained emergency professionals at the bottom line, I think that that's one thing that we have to remember is that the military forces are the end of the sword, right? And they're also the shield. But for a lot of countries at the end of the day, these are also, emergency professionals that are trained that have a very specific special set of skills, and when you think about all of the things that people do to train in the military, so many of those things cross over with emergency disaster rescue, all of that, and so I think that, this is what our allies think of as being efficient and effective and economies of scale, right? And so, kind of how the American perception of it is like, oh, you have them do that, then maybe they're not specialized enough. And so, kind of, I see both of the arguments, but, I think that the interesting thing is that you brought up is the whole idea that, we don't talk about NORTHCOM and NORAD very much because it doesn't get very much action because, it's not a hot button region. And this is what we want from our institutions, right? Institutions, we want them to bring a stable equilibrium of expectations of behavior. And this is what we witnessed on 9/11 is that the institutions and the relations that had kind of been built between the United States and Canada over this period of 50 years, really function in a way that none of us, that none of us in the United States really thought of in retrospect. I think as an institutional scholar, I found a level of comfort in the fact that in the end of the day, the job was done. There was no more civilian loss of life. It was done in peace and in order. When you start thinking about just this mobility crisis, there could have been a lot of other disastrous things that kind of happened. But, this is a side story that entirely never really unfolded because, it was simply that's kind of the Canadian, this unsung, undersung role of, Trudeau has this quote where Trudeau's father has this quote where he talks about that, living next to Canada is like living next to an elephant. It's going to roll over and crush you at some point, and I like to think about, NORAD as an institution where Canada really tries to make space to stop the elephant from trampling it.
Yeah,
and, this is and this is what it did with the 2004 amendment on ballistic missile defense, where it requires the United States to consult Canada through NORAD if it ever decides to use ballistic missile defense in North America. This is very important for Canada. They're not in the command and control piece. But in Ottawa, this became very politically important as the United States decided to go forward, with strategic defense. And so we can see how Canada inside this institution really created that way to give itself space, to give itself consultation, and I think that that's also, interesting in context of 2004, which was, a re-election cycle. It was a cycle where a lot of people, George Bush wasn't necessarily supposed to win, one might say. And so I think it was interesting, and one might say is a difficult bargaining environment that they managed to create that kind of protection for themselves. And so I think that also speaks a little bit to the idea that there's that trust and confidence really comes from those relations that are deep, because of the Air Force's kind of key role in that whole NORAD piece. Right. All of the other actors are involved. We know, that all of the other pieces are involved. Of course, the Army, the Navy, but really when it comes to that piece, which is there is, and you can't deny that. And I think that that's also one of the other, essential stories that you have to tell when you talk about NORAD and when you talk about, how North American aerospace defense happens. Functional part of it is this Air Force participation. And, we see how that reflects in Ottawa. We see how, NATO and NORAD are constantly invoked in Ottawa to ensure that we have fighters, to ensure that there's mobility and all of that. And so that's also the flip side of NORAD and NATO is that they kind of permit Canada and other allies to use these international commitments in a way that kind of, twists the arm of maybe domestic political opposition. And so we're going to see, I think, even in the next year, more of this, because all of our partners, including the United States, have donated massively to this to support the Ukraine. Right. And so there's going to be military procurement to happen. There's going to be a lot of interest in burden bargaining going on. Well,
and that's what you had indicated your research, your book, and then your research on NATO. So there's going to be a lot of fodder for deeper examinations of all these things. So exactly. And so, well, thank you. Did you have anything else that you wanted
No,
to
I mean, I
talk
feel
about?
like we covered everything on the list. Did I miss anything?
No, that's good. I thought I really enjoyed visiting with you. So
thank you very much.
Of course. It was really great. And we look forward to reading and hearing more from you. And thanks again for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.